Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dolby Institute podcast. We're continuing our conversations with colorists. This is part two of a really interesting deep dive into Dolby Vision that we started a few weeks ago. And I'm pleased to have the Dolby team back to take us back into the intricate world of Dolby Vision and HDR. And we're going to be led on this journey by Tom Graham, who is my colleague at Dolby, and he's the head of Dolby Vision content enablement. So really glad to have the team back and glad to give this platform for another really deep dive conversation into Dolby Vision. Tom, this is all you. Take it away.
Awesome, Glenn. Thanks again for the intro and excited to be here for episode number 2. We had a great time doing episode number 1, really talking about the history and sort of the background of our 3 colorists who work at Dolby. And let's just take a quick minute to reintroduce you to them before we dive into really a much deeper dive on how you can work in HDR or wide color gamut, how you think about your approach to it, and really some tips, some thoughts around takeaways that you can walk away with and actually put to use. So let me introduce the colorists quickly. We have Shane, Greg, and Rick. Go ahead, Shane, you do your quick intro.
I'm Shane Ruggieri. I'm a colorist for Dolby. Been working here since about 2010 and just love to work with these beautiful images.
Yeah, hi, I'm Greg Hamlin, working at Dolby now about 6 years and really enjoying doing Dolby Vision grading and helping creatives and DPs and directors become familiar with the format and to utilize it to tell their stories.
Hi, I'm Rick Taylor. I've been with Dolby for about 8 years and been there for the dawn of PQ. And we've my main job is to create tools, and that's what we've been doing at Burbank.
That's great. Well, again, I'm super thrilled to be working with you guys on a daily basis. You show me great things. I learn from you all the time and have a lot of fun doing it. So, you know, where we kind of left off was really the history of sort of that birthing of PQ, as you mentioned, Rick, working with monitors like the Pulsar, and then getting into Dolby Vision and understanding how you created HDR imagery, and then the tools around the workflow and the metadata. So we'll start with, I think, just a conversation around, as we meet new colorists and we work with new people, how do you take out their SDR Rec 709 brain that they've been working with for, say, the last 20 years or so, and how do you put in a new HDR wide color gamut brain that's more open to sort of extending highlights and not maybe crushing or the blacks or clipping the skies? How do you change that mindset? And Rick, jump in and give us your starting point, your starting thoughts.
Well, it first of all depends on how open the colorist is to doing it. If he feels like he's trapped into doing it, you have to use a crowbar. And if he's open to it, then you can easily show the colorist where he can create in that space, because the space is really big, both color and luminance. It's so big that you can make whatever kind of a picture you want. And, of course, the client's going to be the stop there wherever they want it. But to realize that you have that kind of space, you really have to get used to working in it. So put something up that you're familiar with and then push yourself is usually a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Greg, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Rick and Shane would agree with me that it takes you a while to get used to looking at HDR, and it takes some playing around with it for a bit. I know a lot of colorists don't have that opportunity. They're thrown right into, here's the tools and learn this today, and next week you're doing a show. But I think as one spends more time doing grading and looking at the images, and you get used to that, then you become more familiar and you get more confident about how to use the tools and where to go with the image. And then as far as directors and DPs, if I'm working with somebody, I'll ask them if this is their first time seeing or doing an HDR grade. And if that's the case, we'll sometimes show them that Fantasy Flights footage and just to get their eyes used to it. And then the next thing is usually to show proof that we can take their image and we're not going to screw it up. We're not going to break it. And to show sensitivity and awareness that they've worked hard to create the kind of aesthetic for the story they're telling. And then to show them how they can take advantage of HDR to do that even further.
Shane.
I think one of the things that I try to do when I show someone HDR for the first time is I like to get my light meter out and I like to show them the real values of just things that they're used to and show them how bright reality is and show them the different ratios. And why I do that is I say, look, this is where you live. This is the stuff you're familiar with. These are the right light levels that you're familiar with. And so are the audiences. And so you don't need to be afraid of just because it's bright, it isn't going to resonate because you're creating a response from them. And to take them around and give them these different light levels, you see their eyes, go, oh, okay, now I'm starting to get it. These are very bright levels. These are various levels in the world around me. Now, I don't have to create that reality, but I can then have some sense of, okay, I'm relating it to this. I'm relating it to that. And you can bring the audience closer to reality or pull them away from reality. And that's a new realm that HDR provides you that you don't get in SDR.
And so in the world of making that transition for you guys, it seems like it's a good foundation to build on SDR. But, in that world of SDR where you automatically feel like you have to start fixing things and bringing the dynamic range down using power windows or keys or your normal tricks of the trade in SDR, you don't have to start there in HDR, right? You actually can put the image up and start working in a logarithmic space or PQ directly, and it's actually easier, right? It starts out where you're not fighting so much, and you almost have to tell your fellow colorists that information, right? Would you say? Anybody jump in on that one?
Right. Well, take for example when you import, say, raw footage, some ARRI Alexa raw footage. We're used to seeing on our 709 monitors a very flat looking image because you've got 6 stops and you're looking at a 14 stop image. So you're just looking at a cross section of it. Whereas if you lay it into, say, a Flanders or a Sony X300, all of a sudden that image comes alive immediately. And the ratios are there and it's a much better looking image right off the bat and allows you to quickly get in and you're not having to fight the ratios or fight to get, this 14 down into 6 or 7. Rick, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, for 30 some years, I was squeezing everything into this space, right? Mm-hmm. And film as well, because it had more dynamic range than video. And so your first job is to get it centered in gamma, right, where you want it. And then fix all the things that you had to break to make the picture fit into that space, right? So at this point, when you get camera raw and you put it up, it's now your decision is to how do I portray this, right? Mm-hmm. It's not how do I make this work in this space. It's wow, where do I go with it?
Yeah, it's more creative, less fix it, right? Would you agree with that, Greg?
Yeah, it definitely just feels like it's easier to put the exposure where you really want it to be. It's just very minor tweaks back to the curve, and you've got nice blacks with rich detail, and you've got highlights and good rich midtones and so forth that fall into place really easily, as opposed to pushing it around and working it kneading it like dough to try to get it to look attractive.
Interesting. And can you all just tell me, in the sense of what your timeline working space is that you find suits you best to create HDR imagery? Now, I know there's a lot of controversy about working sort of in PQ or working in camera space or, so maybe just take a minute and walk us through your thought process there. Rick, we'll start with you on this one and then we'll go back from Greg to Shane.
I obviously prefer to work in in the EOTF, right? So I like to work in PQ and use the color journey, either in Baselight or Resolve to put it in that space. So you take it out of camera space, bring it into a PQ timeline and operate that way. I feel that gives me the best range to work with.
And you like how the controls feel in that PQ as opposed to, say, a gamma SDR space, right?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. You're grading in log when basically in PQ. You're in a log space, and if you're used to working in a log space, it's the right feel. You get everything you want. If you're used to working in gamma, you have to kind of get used to that, working in log space. Greg,
how about you?
Yeah, I found, sort of transitioning from working in gamma into PQ pretty quick and easy. I mean, didn't take long before the controls felt natural and I felt like I could put things where I wanted them to go. So I work the same way in PQ, and I just find that works better for me. It's more efficient for me.
Okay. Shane, what's your timeline working space of choice?
I actually will bounce between P3, PQ, depending on the delivery requirements, or I'll work in the actual camera timeline color space. Resolve limits the color space in that timeline to that choice. And sometimes a client, like I had a client ask to work in the color space of the camera. And we were able to do that very seamlessly. It wasn't an issue. And so I feel like you can work in almost any of those color spaces in there, just understand what's happening to it, what limitations you're going to have. And ultimately, you can get the feel, you can adjust the knobs to make it feel kind of right.
That's cool. And then in terms of what color gamut do you prefer to work in? Maybe you guys could just take a few seconds. And now I know a lot of that's studio dependent per se, but do you have a preference? Do you like P3 or Rec 2020?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's about deliverable and also your monitoring. If you trust your monitor and you can work in 2020, if you're familiar with it, I mean, I don't think any monitor hits full 2020, and each one does it in a slightly different way, a little bit blue here and a little less red here, or whatever it is. I think if you understand your monitor and understand where it lacks, and you can develop images and you can see the images and your client approves the images, I think those working spaces are, I think you can get away with just working in pretty much any of those, in my opinion.
Okay. Greg?
Yeah, I think just because of the fact that I want to be able to trust that I'm seeing everything on the monitor, I tend to work in P3, even if the deliverable is 2020, and then do a P3 limited.
And do the conversion at the end, right?
Right.
Yeah. Rick?
Well, since currently, I mean, I like to work in 2020 and in wide color gamut on the projector. However, their primaries are all different from each other, and every monitor's primaries are different. So if we're doing something that's going to go out of house, unless it's specifically meant to be wide color gamut, we work in P3 because that's what we recommend to the outside world.
Okay. And then in terms of, getting started in the journey and converting your SDR brain to the HDR brain, how important are scopes, and how much do you rely on, say, internal scopes of, say, Resolve or other products, and then how much should you rely on external scopes? Rick, to you.
I knew I'd get this one. Yeah, well, I like external scopes mostly because they are generally more full-featured than what you get internally on a grading system. And unless you just don't have them, then you use what you got. But yeah, I like to know where my picture is going, especially if you're going to exceed 1,000 nits and you're using a 1,000 nit monitor. Your scopes can tell you if you've got issues. You might be clipping on the monitor, but you can tell if everything's lined up properly on the scopes, and you can have confidence in that.
That's a really good point. And I guess to just before I turn it over to Greg and Shane on that one, Rick, do you find as you're setting levels and trying to dial things in, that the scopes are helping guide you, keep you, so the scenes are relative to each other, and maybe you choose like a 1500 nit peak, you're not going to go over that. Is that how it works?
Often, yeah. I mean, it really depends on the show, but you know, you want to be able to know what's going on. That it was always a problem in the old days, you know, when you were bringing things up and you knew that you were going to be clipping at 100 nits, you know, in gamma. Mm-hmm. We have often gotten some of those things back that were mastered in gamma, and we have to convert them to PQ and make PQ versions of them for Dolby Vision. Mm-hmm. The skies are purple because you're literally clipping. You don't know how you're clipping. You just know that it's white. Right, but when you actually look at it, it's the wrong color, and you have to fix that. And so you don't want to do that inadvertently either, because even though you're doing something, you know, that's also a problem for having a cutoff. Let's say 400 or 600 nits cutoff in your not your display, but in your mastering setup on your grading system.
Right. So you
may not know what you're doing up there.
Yeah, you don't want a hard clip, say, or even some sort of roll off LUT on your output, is what you're saying.
Right. I think it's dangerous, and so the scopes will allow you to have more headroom and to keep yourself honest in that regard.
That's great. Greg, to you on that one.
Yeah, I mean, like Rick, because of a lot of the features, it's nice to use external scopes. But obviously, particularly now with the pandemic going on and people are doing grading at home, and so the internal scopes work quite well. I mean, you can certainly make sure you're not clipping or crushing blacks, or so. You know, I do both. Obviously, I use both depending on the situation. And
yeah, I've seen you guys work, and you know, watching you and how you sort of look at the midtones, where the midtones are sitting, where the highlights are going. You're confirming in two places. You're confirming on the monitor, and you're confirming on what the scopes do. And getting started in HDR, I think it helps you be more comfortable, right, and be more confident.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can use the scopes in that way to kind of say, well, is there more detail in those shadows? Can I get more out of the blacks? Or, you know, do I want to stretch those highlights a little bit more or compress them more? And so, yeah, I definitely rely upon the scopes probably as much as I do the image on the monitor. And
both of you guys, I should mention, are you have experience with multiple of the color grading systems, but tend to work mostly in baselight, and so you do like the external scopes with your baselight, correct?
Yeah, although now that I'm working at home, obviously I'm using the internal scopes on both Resolve and baselight, and they work fine.
Got it.
I have internal scopes on the Resolve I have here on the premises.
Right on. And Shane, talk to us about your feeling on how important internal/external scopes are to your again, mostly research you do, right?
Right. I think it's who I'm working with is how I determine it, as well as if the client isn't savvy or isn't, they don't understand what's going on behind the screen. They're only looking at, I need to approve what I see. And then you've got something different going on. You can use the scopes. You can use, I would say you'll be able to use the scopes to say, look, that information is not blowing out. What's blowing out is the monitor, and you can explain that to them. You can bring down the image and say, look, it's not clipping. There isn't a clipping there. But you could also use that in the opposite way as well, as it sometimes inexperienced, people looking at content who don't have a lot of HDR experience, they can get tricked by the image. If it's really extremely bright, even I can get tricked by the image. If I'm looking at something and it's really bright, and I don't see the dark details, and all of a sudden I'm pushing up the dark details, and I'm, really raising it up so that I can see them. All of a sudden, when I make my 709 or render out my 600 nit, then I've got a little bit of stuff that I got to balance out there. And so there's something that you can do. You can look at the scopes and say, look, I'm really lifting those blacks. I need to pull that back down. Even though I can't see the detail, it's going to affect the downstream image. And you can use them in that way and balance those kind of decisions out, or go back and change the grade. I think scopes are valuable for that, to even just say, look, here, you see this? You can't see it, and that's okay. It's because there's a bright object, and that's closing your eye down. So you're not going to be able to see those blacks. Do you want them crushed, or do you want them lifted? That's going to ultimately affect your downstream image.
That's great. Okay, so we'll sort of shift now into, we've talked about sort of the tools and how you get set up, your working space. For the sake of argument, your timeline is, in a PQ space. You've limited yourself to P3. You've got your external scopes. You're really revved and ready to go. Where the heck do you kind of start positioning these images? I mean, the number one question we probably get is, where do the midtones sit, right? And how do I know where to place things? So as you sit with new colorists, and I know it's dependent. I totally get that. Every show is different. Every scene is sort of different. But in just a general sort of sense, what's your starting point? What do you look for? Shane, we'll start with you on this one.
I think it's the monitor that you have in front of you start with. I think that's the way to, for me, that's the way to start. If I've got a very bright monitor, then I can say, okay, I can move things around and maybe create an image at that point. A brighter image if I want to create a brighter image. Obviously, it's the client. It's going to be the client depending on what they're comfortable with. But if, let's just say the client says, go for it, let's make great imagery, let's push the limits and see what we get. Then you have a conversation about the overall story arc and the luminance arc of the whole picture. What are the things that you can put? Can you put a lot of stuff up here, down here? These are the things you can do. And you talk to them and you educate them, or you just inform them, hey, you've got some dark scenes and then a bright scene and then some middle scenes. How far do you want those separated? Do you want overlapping light? Do you not want overlapping light? These are the things that you can do. Does it matter to you? Does it matter for the story? And you have that conversation. I think as you become more educated in HDR and you learn that you can do these things, I think those things will be told to us as colorists. We don't want any overlapping between these two scenes. We want these all dark. We don't want any overlapping them on this beach scene. We don't want any dark levels in here. In fact, see a big space between there. But those are things that are going to be, I think, in time that people will get used to using, and they're going to start telling us. Right now, we have to introduce it to them.
Okay. And Greg, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's sort of, there are kind of three different things I think that help establish this. One of them, of course, is just the spec of your deliverable. Are you doing a 4,000 nit master, or are you doing a 1,000 nit master? But then comes the aesthetic and what kind of, what's appropriate for the story. And then another element that comes down to it is, as Shane refers, the clients need to have some comfort level as well. So, even if a scene is dark, specular highlights or, practical lights in the distance could be very, very bright. They could, reach the peak luminance for the grade you're doing, or they could be dimmer. So it entirely depends on those three things, I think.
Well, that's a really good point, isn't it? That, for the most part, let's say you have a darker aesthetic show, and very much the midtones and shadow details can live very similarly to the SDR grade, right? But then you could explore just the specular highlights and as you said, maybe practicals like candles or, those types of things. And where do those highlights sit? And can those highlights actually have detail or color in them, right?
Yes, exactly. And in fact, to be honest, during the early days of this, when we were doing remastering of shows that had been mastered in SDR, there were times where it was clearly, everything was at 100 nits or below. And the only place that made sense to have anything go above was in the specular highlights. And there would be moments I would think, yeah, we should pop those a little bit so at least somebody could tell this is in fact the HDR grade, right?
All right, Rick, what about you?
Well, for darker material, the areas that you can explore are the kind of low mids and those areas. You can get depth and detail in the image that you couldn't get in SDR.
And why is that? Just to pause you there, because essentially the first 0 to 100 nits, are they not the same? But how do we get more detail in the shadows?
They're not the same. The curve is different, right? You're dealing with a gamma curve, and now you're dealing in PQ. So you can actually find detail and interest in those darker areas. Mm-hmm. And when you have to bring down gamma, you're really kind of flattening everything down toward the bottom, and you don't have that much distance between things, but you can get it in PQ. Mm-hmm. And it's a much more interesting picture.
In terms of Rick, where I know there is no starting point for midtones per se, but as you approach a new grade, say on a normal outdoor scene, midday, is there a starting point where you feel you can place the skin tones and such?
Yeah, it really goes with the picture for me. I mean, I wouldn't say that face needs to be at 100 nits, mm-hmm. right? Or 60 nits or whatever. It just, because you've got such range to play with, it's a scene by scene thing. Whatever's happening in the scene, that's where you want to place everything. So it's pleasing to the eye, and right. It follows the director's vision and gives them the aesthetic that they're looking for.
Yeah, and I guess the clues that we get to try to figure that out on any given shot are how it's lit, for one thing, right? I mean, you kind of tell from the lighting, is this person in shadow and more silhouetted, or are they front lit, or, so those things. And then in comparison to how things are lit in the background are kind of the clues that we go by, I guess, to try to figure out where to put that. But there's definitely no hard and fast rule about trying to figure out where to put those things.
Assuming everything went toward the plan in the in the production, right?
Yes.
Like, oh God, I don't have enough fill on this shot. So
yeah,
you'll create that, right, as you would with the color correction system, and then
And it's an opportunity for us too. It's an opportunity just for us to show them, hey, look, you're looking for a little bit of punch. Let's pull this out of their typical comfort zone, raise that way up, pull that, and let them see it from where they came from, and see it, hit them and go, wow, okay, yeah, that actually helps the story. That helps this moment, and let them decide, whoever's in control of that image.
Yeah, and I think that's a good part of what we do as we're trying to bring somebody that's not familiar with HDR to become more comfortable with it and to find out what it can do. We might do a grade initially that we think matches what we've gotten from their notes or their initial, instructions to us, and then we might do some of these things that taking advantage of, skin highlights or something with midtones, and then have that, as a grade that's bypassed, and then say, by the way, what do you think of this? We could do this to this. And
Greg, that was actually my next question was, as you, it's actually a two-part question. So I'll just throw it out there. You guys jump in on it as you feel. Part one is, and let's just say you're starting the work sort of unsupervised. You're by yourself. Number one is, as you explore this content and you get started and you start grading in HDR, should you give yourself 2 or 3 reels on a 6 or 7 reel movie to get comfortable? Because by the time you get to reel 3, you realize, you know what? I probably could have gone back and been a little bit more aggressive on reel 1 and reel 2, but I sort of found my place in reel 3. So question number 1 is time. Give yourself a little time to get comfortable with the material. And then the second question is, do you back pocket, as I call it, in your back pocket, have the more aggressive grade, and then maybe a conservative version that you keep, you keep them both. And which one do you show first to your client? So
your preference.
Yeah.
That's totally true. Totally true.
Good. All right. So Rick, you start us off on this one.
Well, I mean, you generally when you see a mastering of a feature on television, the first reel looks kind of rough. Nobody really gets the feel of the movie until they're in the second reel.
Okay.
I mean, it's just a thing, right? So when you're in the second reel, you're going along, and you go back and you look at the first reel, and you're like, I'm going to have to fix that. And so that happens regardless of whether you're working, in high dynamic range or standard dynamic range. But yeah, you if you're going to work with a client, you give them your best shot first, and then they'll pull the reins back, and
Okay. And
or they'll let you go.
And then by reel 3,
by reel 3, then they'll say, "Oh, you know what? Maybe we could go back to reel 1 and go a little further."
And so you find that your preference is the one that's usually has a little bit more aggressiveness to it, maybe a little bit brighter highlights, brighter mid-tone kind of thing.
I think for me, I like to push the envelope to show what's possible and to show them, look, you can tell stories in different ways, and there are real reactions you can have with these light levels that are just not typically used. And whether they want to employ those or not are up to them. But to show them, you can't know and make a decision until you see it and feel it out. And these guys are really good at understanding what they're seeing and how they're reacting to it. And they're going to make a good decision at that point. But if they never see it, they're not going to be able to make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, part of it's knowing your client too.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, and I think if you have legitimate reasons to make those choices that support the story, and you articulate that, then often clients will say, "Yeah, that makes sense for the scene," or let's go ahead and look at it that way and see how that goes.
Yeah, and show them the 600 nit. Show them the 600 nit. Show them that 100 nit. What results out of doing this push at the top end at your brightest level. Quickly just do an analysis and then show them. Say, look, this is what you're getting on the bottom end. Here's what you're getting at 600, and then they can look at it and go, "Wow, okay, or no, let's pull that back."
Right. All right. Well, we'll get to the Dolby Vision part in a minute, in terms of the analysis and that sort of workflow. So in terms of, maybe a tip, Greg, you mentioned practical effects and sort of lighting and things that can either appear too bright or maybe you didn't take advantage of them. How do you work with practical effects so that they don't become distracting to the actors and the key story points on the screen? Yeah,
that one's sort of difficult because it really relates so much to what the client, the creatives are how they feel about it, right? So there's some people who, if there's anything in the background that's as bright or brighter than, say, the face of the actor, they want that pulled down. They find that really distracting. And certainly people, I think, who have a commercials background, that's the case. And then others, sort of follow or understand more of what Shane was explaining about how the actual real world is far more dynamic range than what we're seeing on the screen. And so they're quite accepting of very bright highlights in the background because they realize that's how it would look if you were standing there. The person's face in front of you might be a little darker and the street light in the back is blowing out. So it really, my preference and tendency is to have those practicals and quite bright. But I'm also prepared usually with a layer that has a key or ready to pull it down for the client if it's too much for them.
That's a great tip. So you're already sort of anticipating. You're gonna to Rick's point. You're gonna find your starting point that you like, and then you'll have your key layer ready to pull it down if they don't like it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Rick.
Well, and it also depends on other factors like, especially if you're outdoors, you're going to have things change over time of day, and so you're going to darken skies and that sort of thing. Like the second half of our piece, Lowrider, one direction was shot earlier in the day, and the reverse was shot later in the day. So in order to marry all that up, I had to do a lot of sky work in both directions. Right, I had to make the reverse skies a little brighter and the first shot skies a little darker. So yes, a key layer, and sometimes a shape layer, and all this sort of thing that you would need to accomplish that. So, so that's another place where you'd go there for that.
Sure. Shane, how about you in sort of managing the world of practicals? And I know you, like you said, you'd like to be a bit more aggressive on what the HDR grade can be. And obviously practicals and lighting can really fit into that.
I think it's up to the story. I think you have to look at the story and say, will this help the story? And again, showing I always go back to going outside, looking at what lights are. I actually will show a client, so here's an indoor, concert, and there's a 4,000, massive lights behind the person singing, and I'll stop it where they're standing right in front of the light, and I'll say, look, can you see her face? Can you see the detail in her face? And they, 99.9 say, yes, I can see the detail. I say, right, because this is working it out. Your brain is working those things out, and you focus in different things. So the lights are not necessarily distracting. I think those are other things. At 100 nits, maybe they're distracting because you're working in such a small space. But when you've got a much larger space, those lights give you a different sense, and your brain is already used to working those things out. So you get a different reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting. You guys are really, so much of it is how you deal with the client and the client interprets it, and how there's obviously a lot of back and forth here. There's no easy recipe for making perfect HDR images, right?
One other thing is that when we were remastering all those titles for Dolby Vision, obviously those were graded, and we were just putting them in the space for the most part. But you would find that the practicals were really bright, right? Because the practicals, they knew they were going to be held back in the standard grade to mesh with the environment. So you always were pulling practicals down to fit in the environment.
So what you're saying, Rick, is if they were shooting for an SDR delivery, that's where they knew they were going, and maybe those practicals would clip or fit nicely into that 100-nit container. Once you reveal that same footage with all its glory in PQ, all of a sudden it's extremely bright.
Yes, and out of place oftentimes in terms of how bright the room is, right? That sort of thing. So you have to pull them back.
Yeah, sometimes you even have to ask the client, now we can see a lot of the detail. We can actually see the filaments in the light bulb. Do you want that? Right? Or the lace curtains. Now we see the full texture of the, and most of the times people are like, oh yeah, that's great. I love that. I'm glad we can see that. And, but it's something, you've got to check with them about. And
do you find that you have to sort of help people fight the urge to just clipping the highlights and getting that crushed blacks or the clipped highlight look, right? Now that you can have all this detail?
It depends. For example, we had a 10K in a doorway that was supposed to blow out on on a Red Bull skateboard video. It was not wanted.
Right.
They didn't want to see that. So so we had to find a creative way to blow it out, right?
Yeah, they didn't want to see the grip standing on the ladder next to it either, right?
Yeah, that's that classic example where a 10K light is supposed to be daylight. Yeah, and
or be a sun. Be the sun.
Not an HDR. Yeah, exactly. So I guess before we move on to the Dolby Vision metadata portion, in terms of starting with the HDR grade, creating the HDR grade, any thoughts or tips you guys have? What is your key takeaway that you'd want to tell someone who's embarking on this journey? They're a good friend. They're like, they're going to start with the HDR grade first. They might be a little nervous. They might not know. What would be the one thing you'd want them to know? And I'll start with you, Greg.
Well, I think my advice would be to begin with the HDR grade. And I think most colorists would be open to that, but I definitely know that there are folks who really want to start with SDR. That's what they're familiar with. That's what they know, and they've become efficient with. And maybe their circumstances such high pressure that they need to do that in order to meet a schedule or something. But I really believe it's important to start with the HDR grade, because when you do the analysis and you're going to do the trims and you've got the derived SDR grade from that, there's so many benefits. You have so many more choices. You get to preserve highlight detail and black detail. You preserve color saturation and highlights and so on. And so you can end up with a much better SDR derived. But I understand that it's challenging for folks. It's new, and it's something that would make them feel uncomfortable or a bit nervous about being quick at it. But I would assure them that you'll develop that skill very quickly. It will be, just a matter of days, but before you're like feeling quite confident, and then another couple of weeks before you say, "Oh yeah, now I really know where I want to put this," and so on. So that would be my advice.
That's great. How about you, Shane?
I totally agree with what Greg is saying. You want to start with the HDR grade because of how it lays in and all the choices that you can make. You can quickly make good decisions on contrast, where things should sit, and you get the most out of it. And on top of that, when you map it down to say 600 nits or 100 nits, then you can really see those choices pay off. And, as we know, most TVs are 200 nits and above. And so when you're looking at that lower end, know that that's going to be stretched up. And I think that people just get really excited when they start to see those HDR images on 600 nit TVs when you make those choices first at, your 1000 nits or your 2000 or 4000 nit masters. Cool.
And so, Rick, you have 2 votes for number 1 key takeaway is be comfortable working with the HDR first. So what is your one main piece of advice for a new colorist in HDR?
Well, I would prefer starting in HDR. Theatrically, means if you're running if you're going to do a theatrical feature, start in HDR. I know we're not quite there yet with all of the tools that we're planning now and coming out with, but the idea would be to start there, and when you bring that to the home version, you will start with PQ. You'll put it in the proper space for that viewing, right? For 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 nits, whatever the television will do. One of the things you'll find when you're doing HDR first and then deriving your SDR is if you have situations where there are skies that are bright and have a lot of information in them, like in our Fantasy Flights show, right? There's one shot where a girl is at a box with flowers and out in the middle of the field, and there's a bright sky behind her with a lot of cloud detail. Well, in the SDR, you're probably going to key that sky, right? In the HDR, you don't have to. You've got the entire range, and the mapping software is going to make the SDR automatically have that information in it. So you're going to be doing probably less work. You don't have to window that as you would if you were starting with SDR. And trying to translate that back to HDR, if you start off with SDR and you've done all this stuff to the picture, you may be wanting to undo things that were done before to get a better HDR image.
So is it safe to say then that, in the world of before HDR grading, you had, say, a 14-stop image that you captured with the camera, but by grading on a 6.5-stop system for SDR, you just couldn't see what was up here and you couldn't see what was below that threshold. And so you were sort of handicapped because you couldn't actually see all that extra information. But once you open it up and you can see it and place it properly, then the Dolby Vision mapping helps maintain it and complete it.
Correct.
I don't know if you can't see it. You could see that information. I think it's just that you then had to then do... Yeah, I mean, you can pull it back in and you just couldn't see it in all its glory. I think that's the biggest thing. You might be able to know that there's detail there, but then now you've got to go in and, a lot of... Yeah.
They're there because you're taking this, squeezing it into that, and trying to get all those elements back in the picture.
Yeah, but you basically have a bigger window. That means you can really see it right from the get-go and sort of decide, to Shane's point, on how it helps your story or hinders your story, and where do you want to place it, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, and in terms of time to create this HDR grade, is there like a rule of thumb, let's say on a 1-hour show, how much time you would spend doing this HDR grade? I know that's probably not a fair question, but I'm going to ask it. So,
what's your budget?
Yeah.
How am I billing?
Well,
am I hourly or am I per show?
Okay, let's just do this then. Let's say compared to an SDR grade, does the HDR grade take the same amount? Is it less? Is it usually faster? Is it take more time?
I would say basically it's the same, especially if you're doing a DI. Shots are coming in, the thing takes whatever amount of time it takes as pieces arrive, right? And then re-edits and all those sort of things. So I think for a production that's doing their first pass, it'll take the same amount of time.
Greg or Shane, any thoughts on that?
I think there's an advantage of starting in the HDR because, as I think both Greg and Rick have said, you see more. And you're quicker to make the decisions, and you're able to quickly show where that image, and you can rely on the DP a lot more to say, look, they shot it like this. Here's what it looks like. There you go. And a lot of times you're not wrestling and having to kind of recreate what the DP is trying to capture and trying to say in that moment. I think it gives you more time to make the image better or to do something that maybe you couldn't get to before.
Yeah, you have more time to be creative, right?
Yeah, because you can get where you want to quicker.
You'll see elements of the picture that you wouldn't have seen. It's like when Avid first came out, it was so low resolution that you didn't get to see the boom in the shot until you got into the color grading session. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
So there's that. You got to fix things. Sometimes you got to fix things and oh, look at the cables. Oh, let's throw a mat on that, throw something on there. And so it does allow you it kind of works both ways, I think.
All right. So another non-answer. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on to the final step. Once you've completed your HDR grade, that's when the Dolby Vision process really starts. And so let's just start with a high-level sort of theoretical question to you. What do you guys feel? Again, you're talking to your new friend, your old friend you've known for a long time. He or she's going to be a new colorist doing HDR Dolby Vision. They're asking you, why do I have to do this metadata? What's the purpose of this process to create the metadata? So, Rick, you're the first one on the hot seat.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, the metadata is to inform the downstream device as to what the look is supposed to be. That's basically it. So you create the metadata, and Walter out there, wherever you are, the dynamic metadata is so you get the best out of each shot.
Okay, and then we'll talk about how you create this dynamic metadata in a minute. But Greg, let's get your thoughts. If you're explaining to somebody the first time, why do I need the Dolby Vision part? If I just created my HDR grade, what does the Dolby Vision metadata do?
Right. Well, I would start and say exactly what Rick said just now, and add that it's also your opportunity in terms of the trims values to make sure that artistic intent is kept both in the 709 derived version, but also will be made to reproduce as accurately as it can on any other device downstream.
Mm-hmm. And because nowadays there are so many different types of devices with different capabilities, it's important to have metadata to inform it, as you said, Greg, how to maintain the look or the artistic intent from that 1500 nit or 1000 nit show you did down to 200 nits, right? Or even 100 nits.
Yep.
So Shane.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything you'd tell your friend?
Yeah, I think also I would start with both of what they've said, but I also say, you're not going to expect to have the same kind of exact same kind of look on a 1000 nit versus a 100 nit image. They're different brightnesses. There's different choices that have to be made, or that probably will be made. And what that metadata allows you to do, and just to spell it out a little bit deeper, is to say, in this image, in this particular scene, in this particular image, I have now metadata to do things to it to better tell that story in that moment that I can't do with luminance or color over here. I need to do something different. I still need to tell that story. I still need to make that impact. But now I've got a tool to allow me to move that image around that may look different than this, but it's got the same impact. And I think that's critical that they have those tools, because it may shift away, like put more saturation down here because you can't pop it with highlight or with luminance. Do something different, recontrast it to make it feel different in order to then better tell that story. And so it's not just artistic intent necessarily. There's a lot of tools to change that image to better tell that story, which ultimately is your artistic intent.
Cool. And so in terms of dynamic metadata, that means shot by shot. And obviously it's very important to have a properly cut up timeline or an EDL to make sure that you're going to represent the shot correctly. And then think about, if you were again explaining to your colorist friend what Dolby Vision algorithm they should use for content mapping. Is it 2.9? Is it 4.0? What does the studio spec say? Maybe take us through your thoughts on navigating that choice, if there is a choice to be made. So Shane, I'll start with you. 2.9 or 4.0, and what are your thoughts on the differences between the two?
If I were to give them advice, I would say start in 4.0. You have a lot more tools. We've listened to the artist through 2.9, and we've got feedback, and we made 4.0 a lot more responsive in many different ways. We've added some tools that allow a lot more movement on saturation and hue to fix some issues that, when you're translating from a massive color space down to a much smaller color space, that allow us to do that more effectively and to really get that image. And I think Rick had some ideas on some other points on that. Rick, you were talking to me earlier about that. Why don't you say what you were saying then?
I would if I could remember it, but yeah. one of the things that you have with 4.0, the backwards compatibility is very good to 2.9. In fact, it's improved so much that sometimes certain things we've looked at, I think that 2.9 version is better than the original. And that's because we improved it. We improved right. That as we will, and that keeps me employed.
That's a good thing. Yeah. Yep.
I would always start with 4.0.
Okay. If you had a choice in the argument, if the studio is accepting either 4.0 or 2.9, great. And then Greg, any comments for you on your experiences with 4.0, 2.9, and where you'd want to go?
Yeah, I think the improvements that we made, particularly in the analysis, make it a lot easier. I know that we experienced some frustration early on with 2.9 and trying to do the trims, and because in that case we were actually trying to match the 709 derived to a reference, and so that really forced us to recognize some of the difficulties in getting that same sort of curve often, and that's where we began to initiate feedback and show examples. I think we talked about that part one a little bit about and the engineers worked on that and really improved it a lot. So if you are given a choice, using 4.0 you'll find it'll be easier for you.
That's cool. And then as you sort of run the analysis on the shots, and then you turn on your CMU process, either the internal CMU or the external CMU, but you then look at it mapping all the way down to SDR 100 nits Rec 709. And what's your initial thoughts? Like when you sort of start that process of going ahead to do a trim, do you have like a game plan? Is there a specific, do you go to find the most representative shot of that scene? try to come up with the trim starting point and then copy and paste it across the scene? Or what is your typical thought process? And Rick, we'll start with you on this one.
Okay. Well, yeah, I tend to look at the entire sequence and see, from probably from the master shot, see how to trim that, and I might apply those trims. And then if you have any outliers, anything with something that's causing the image to close down a little bit too much, like a huge bright window or something behind the subject, we now have tools in 4.0 that you can adjust the analysis point in what we call L3 in the metadata, and fix that, and then trim that separately. So
and that's
you go through and...
Is that called mid-tone offset then, as the control?
It is.
Yeah.
It is on Resolve.
All right. You essentially do what I sort of outlined, which is you basically find the most representative shot, maybe do a slight trim to really maintain your look, and then you copy and paste that to all the shots in that scene, and then you go through and maybe deal with any of the outliers that don't fit as well.
Right.
Cool. And Greg, what's your thought process?
Yeah, I do the exact same thing, and generally it wouldn't be for the whole show or the whole reel, but it would be you've got the interior garage scenes and the various coverage there, and then exterior tennis court or whatever. So as I get into each new sequence, then I would use that same technique. Yeah.
Okay. Shane?
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, I think it depends on how you approach the grading. If you're doing HDR, then going back and doing the SDR. I know some colorists are doing HDR, SDR at the same time. And in that situation, you would begin in, and as you get to something that, say, as a challenging shot, you might go back and ripple that in, or try to match it back through. I think either approach is going to get you where you need to go. You have the tool. You've got the ability of moving that image around to fit where you're trying to go a lot better than we had in 2.9. Yeah.
You bring up a really good point, Shane. And so I'll go right back to you with this question is, in the world of, you've just created this beautiful 1,000-nit HDR masterpiece, you've spent a week on it, and then you run the CMU, the analysis and the CMU mapping to 100 nits. How in the world can you look at an SDR image and be okay with that? Like, how do you manage that? And sometimes, do you have them both side by side? You turn the HDR off? What is your thought process there?
I think it's developed over the years. I think in the early days, I really was like, ew, like
it's shocking. Right,
it was shocking because you're like so used to this image, and all of a sudden it just looks like flat. It looks like, did I do any grading at all on this thing? I'm just kidding. It takes time. It takes time to develop that sense of where this image is going to go. And I think it's critical that you also look at that 600 nit realm, because that's where most people are going to see that image, if it's an HDR representation of it. Again, HDR side of it, not the SDR moved in.
And so for those at home following along, if you're not as familiar, you can change the CMU mapping from 100 nits to 600 nits, and you can see the tone mapping occurring. And again, 600 nits seems like about the average of most televisions on the market.
Right.
Or iPad Pro, for instance.
Right. So. And I think you become pleasantly surprised at how well it maps down and how well that image is represented there.
So, Greg, what's your thought process on, you have a client come in the room. Are you going to show them the HDR and the SDR simultaneously, or make sure they only see one or the other, or that they have a coffee break in between any switching?
I usually try to encourage them to just watch the HDR alone first. But it's entirely up to them, because I'll let them know that I can show them both at the same time with two monitors. And then some of them find it very difficult to do, actually. They get distracted looking back and forth. Some say, you know what, never mind, just turn that off, either the HDR or the SDR. Let me watch that alone first, and then I'll have them. Usually by that time, they just want to glance at the other one and, look at a few shots and sort of feel comfortable that it's looking how it should. it's rare that anybody will sit through the whole show for both, unless they're at a time simultaneously.
I did want to add something here on that, Greg, because I think it depends on the client too, because I brought in corporate clients and that's a different breed. And a lot of times those guys, and those folks, I'll just say those folks, they want to see all of it. They want to see the 100, they want to see the 600, they want to see the 1,000 all at one time, because it's a different approval process, and they want to see, if I'm delivering to that, I want to see it. I want to say yes to it. I want to, and other creative clients sometimes say 4,000 and 100, I'm good. I've seen the ends. But I think as we get to do more user-generated content in corporate and advertising, I think there's going to be an advantage of having every single version up there and being able to see those versions, because someone's going to say, okay, if we're focusing on 1,000 nit for this market, I need to see it. I need to compare it to the 600 nit for that market, and I need to know what the differences are. And I think that's the strength that we have in having the CMU, the external CMUs, to allow you to see these multiple versions at one time. I just don't think it's so prevalent in the creative industry right now, but I think it will.
No, you're right. I think it's your point is that the more advanced users get, let's say this is our 10th Marvel superhero movie that we've done in Dolby Vision. We know the process. We're comfortable living in those two worlds. But for somebody new who just may not have grasped it, it's probably harder to manage all those things at once. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I can fully understand why there would be a difference with sort of corporate or marketing generated stuff, because they want to be able to compare and see what is the differences between them. And it becomes essentially almost like a full QC as well, not just a creative review.
So Rick, jump in. We've been waiting for you now.
In the commercial world, you'll have multiple approvals, but I don't think they'll look at them all at once. One of the things we found when we were doing the remastering is we would have the reference and the mapped and the HDR all at once, and that caused some early burnout with some of our clients that were coming in to view this stuff. They just couldn't do it, and so it got to be I'll look at this thing and then I'll look at that thing.
Okay.
And it was less about the reference as time went on, since you were usually using a graded thing. But yeah, it's tough for people to concentrate on more than one thing at a time. And
do you ever feel that it's helpful to have a lunch break in between the HDR viewing and then the derived SDR viewing, so that really you can sort of cleanse the visual palette? Does that help as well? A little bit of time and space?
I think so. Okay. Because you can sit through the movie, like you're going to make all your decisions on the HDR, and then you may want to go back and redo some of the things in the SDR, and that they may happen on a different day, right, with the client. Right. So that's just fine.
Right.
And I think it does dependent on the length of the piece. I think that's a critical point of action. Is if it's a very much longer piece, yeah, a break would be really good. But if it's like a commercial or a corporate piece where it's much shorter, I think those decisions and those that ability or that burnout is going to be a lot different. And I think that's something that we're going to start to see a lot more of as advertising picks this up, and as the corporate world starts to take on these HDR deliverables. I think that's really going to change. And
commercial houses, they're booked by the hour, and if you're doing long form, that's days that you're working with. So when you get into the bay, you're going to make your decisions and get out the door and go to the next session you have to go to.
In terms of wanting my SDR to look slightly different, or maybe have some clipped highlights or things like that, how does the Dolby Vision trim process fit into that with this metadata and creating, can it look different in that sense?
You can make it look different.
Okay.
One of the things that we found out when we were doing remastering is that the mapping was so good that it wouldn't allow you to blow out the highlights.
Right. It was maintaining the detail of the HDR grade and mapping it down really nicely.
Yeah,
right?
And sometimes to the chagrin of the client, it's like, well, I didn't want to see that, and so like I think it was Man of Steel. There was a particular sky that they put in that was intended to be blown out because they blew up the sky and it had big grain balls in it, and when that shot came up, everybody jumped. It's like, oh my God, how are we going to fix that? And so the trim tools at that point didn't have a way to do highlight clipping. We do now, but it's not a soft clip. So we were still trying to get that to happen, but you can blow things out now.
Okay. Anybody else have a comment on making your SDR look different? Is that a...
I like the idea of it. I like the idea that you're going to tell a story and have certain reactions at these massive nit levels, and then it's going to, go down, and you're trying to create a reaction, and you just physically can't have the same reaction here as you do here, and these tools allow you to just take that into account and do something different with it. I think it's a power. If you didn't have those tools, you kind of hamstrung yourself because you're going to be compromising both of these. You might be pulling this down and not getting the full reaction that you can. And that was the world of 709, right? You're always compromising that image to deal with the range.
In fact, the 4.0 tools do have so much more flexibility that you really can shape it, and because you can do a trim pass at 100 nits and you can do a trim pass at 600 nits if you wanted to, you have different levels of shaping for each one, right?
Right.
Yeah. Greg, any comments before I wrap up with a couple quick questions?
Yeah, no, I think that's true that, now because you have these greater tools, you would be able to make more of a distinction between what the 709 looks like and what any version of HDR in between might.
Yeah.
And so it does give you a little more creative freedom there if you really want to have something different.
So this is kind of a curveball question, but we sometimes get it. So get ready. Put your seatbelt on. Yeah, exactly. So why... We've done all this work and we've set our Dolby Vision grade. Our HDR grade. We've positioned it how we want it. Why do I need dynamic metadata? Why can't it just analyze it and map it? Why do I have to do this individual shot-based trimming and/or analysis?
I think if you take advantage of the range, number one, you take advantage of that HDR range, that when you map that down, then you're going to want to have control over that contrast curve. You're going to want to have control over where that contrast lives in that 709 image. And if you take just one mapping and one curve and you map it down, it's not going to be as effective for each individual shot, especially if you've taken advantage of and really worked in creating that image where you want it and those curves where you want them in the master image.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you've created an artistic impression in the HDR, and the analysis is trying to mathematically put it in what it thinks is the best place for it. And often works very well doing that. But sometimes when you look at this new 709 100 nit version of the shot, it creates a different feeling. And you find in order to try to get closer to what you were trying to make the person feel like, or the emotional reaction, or the story point, you want to adjust it slightly, and you need to be able to do that shot by shot.
Cool. Rick?
Well, before we had dynamic metadata and an algorithm, to analyze and trims to create the look that you really want, we had a static LUT. All this started off with a static LUT, and it looks okay, but it doesn't have the kind of range you want. It doesn't reproduce the curve that you really want. You want it perfect for every shot, and every shot and every scene. Mm-hmm. And a static LUT doesn't do that for you. It just can't.
Not with so many different devices to play back on, right? There's just so many variables on the playback.
Even the initial, when we would look at it on the PRM, through through the static LUT, the PQ to 709 LUT, and through the dynamic mapping, is night and day.
Okay. Last question. In terms of, the whole process and everything you're doing, you've graded on a professional monitor, you've done your analysis and your trims on a professional monitor, you've been using scopes. What would you tell your friend colorist about how they could maybe use a consumer monitor in this equation? What, a consumer HDR, like an LG C8 or C9, what would you say could be useful to learn or utilize there in the process? Start with you, Rick, on this one.
I know we're working on something like this, but you need to not be mapping when you're grading, because you can chase the grade around. Because the television will adjust to what you do.
Okay.
So what you really need is something that will give you pure PQ mode. If you use the HDR10 mode, it already has a curve in it, and so it may not be right. Even though it won't chase your trims around, it's just not optimal either. So
would you? But you could use it. I've seen you use tunneling in a sense to check your final results in your mapping, right?
Sure.
But you're not grading. You're not live grading at that time.
No, and I wouldn't do it just because you can whatever level you're looking at on your C9, you might be making it look good there, but you go to another television with a different luminance range, you may have screwed that luminance range up.
If you're making trims while you're looking at the output of the C9, I get it. Greg, how about you? How do you feel about consumer monitors in the equation of a color bay?
Yeah, I mean, it's useful, I think, to just sort of double check or to give a client confidence, to let them see how it will look at home on that particular kind of model TV. But yeah, it's certainly not practical at all at this point to use those to do your real grading.
Right. In other words, some people do use client monitor situations, but be very careful not to make grading decisions, color-based grading decisions on a consumer monitor.
Unless that monitor is going to be the monitor that you're going to play back that show, if it's for a corporate piece or some other piece, unless you're grading directly for that piece, that would be your one consideration in that regard.
Yeah, we've worked with TV manufacturers to actually grade some of their demo material that will only be running on their TV, and it's usually even model specific. And actually that's when you notice if you keep your regular HDR professional monitor on and you're grading to the television and you keep kind of glancing over what the actual professional monitor shows you, you can see that, yeah, this wouldn't work if I was to try to make this my primary grade for all uses.
Yeah, for some of our marketing stuff, it was being done in vivid mode. There was no vivid mode on any professional monitor. so it was pretty dicey looking stuff. But
yeah, I think to summarize, for most people, you should really only use a consumer monitor in terms of quality control as a final playback step. Don't do any trimming or color grading per se on it. Unless your client happens to be the TV manufacturer and they want a specifically graded piece for that TV.
That's right.
Fair enough. Well, guys, I think this has been super fantastic. You guys have so much experience and knowledge to share. And, I really hope that this has been valuable for our viewers to sort of learn maybe some approaches and things to get started in grading in HDR and Dolby Vision. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and be safe out there.